The current minimum wage in the US is $7.25, which has remained the same since 2009. Across the US, you'll find that mentioning this dollar figure can often spark heated debates from kitchen tables to congressional halls. For some, it's a lifeline that needs to be raised to lift people out of poverty. For others, it's a delicate balance which, if tipped, could lead to inflation and job cuts. So, with something that impacts nearly 1.6 million Americans who currently make $7.25 per hour and serves as the basis for how much many other people earn, what do you know about minimum wages and why we have them? Let's get to the brass tacks. The minimum wage is the lowest amount an employer can legally pay an employee per hour, a standard set by the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act, or FLSA. We'll dive into the history of the FLSA later, but for now, it's important to know that this law establishes the baseline for most workers in the US. Some employees, however, are exempt from the minimum wage protections under the FLSA, but for the majority of Americans, this is the absolute minimum they can be paid. Exceptions include employees of very small businesses that don't engage in interstate commerce and tipped workers. When it comes to tipped workers, employers can pay a lower hourly wage as long as tips bring the total to at least the minimum wage. But here's where it gets complicated. Individual states have the power to set their own minimum wage laws, and these don't always align with the federal standard. In fact, as of 2024, two states, Georgia and Wyoming, have state minimum wages set at just $5.15 per hour, well below the federal mandate of $7.25. This lower state rate is largely symbolic, as the highest minimum wage takes precedence in almost all cases, meaning most workers in these states are still paid at least $7.25 per hour. Why keep these lower state rates? Sometimes it's a political signal, a way for state lawmakers to express their ideological stance, even though the higher federal rate overrides it in practice. This is a stark contrast to the 30 other states and Washington, D.C. that have set their minimum wages above the federal level. For instance, Washington state boasts the highest minimum wage in the country at $16.28 per hour. Meanwhile, the federal minimum has remained unchanged since 2009. Since only congressional action can raise it, a sharp difference from other countries where the minimum wage is automatically adjusted for inflation. So now that we understand the basics of how the minimum wage works in the US, let's discuss its history and current state. All the way back in 1938, during a rise in striking workers and troubling economic conditions amid the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the Fair Labor Standards Act into law. This was a major step forward for the workers' rights movement. While it'd be reasonable to assume that from here on out, everyone in the country was eligible to earn at least 25 cents per hour, that wasn't exactly the case. You see, though Roosevelt believed setting a minimum wage would help stabilize the post-Depression economy, only 20% of workers at the time were eligible for the minimum wage, as it was dependent on the industry you worked in, specifically those involved in interstate commerce. The goal was to protect workers who were most vulnerable to exploitation. By 1968, 30 years since it was first introduced, the law had expanded to cover around 80% of private sector workers. Over the years, Congress has raised the federal wage 22 times. The last time was in 2009 when it went from $6.55 to $7.25 per hour. So that brings us to today, 15 years since the last minimum wage increase. As the cost of living continues to rise, many argue that the current federal minimum wage is not enough to live on. Politicians like Senator Bernie Sanders have proposed raising it to $17 per hour by 2028. Advocates say that a higher minimum wage would boost the economy, while others argue that a significant increase could lead to higher prices for goods and services, job losses, and bad news for small businesses that might struggle to pay higher wages. The future of the federal minimum wage remains uncertain. As of now, any changes would require congressional action, and in the meantime, states and cities will continue to set their own standards, creating a patchwork of minimum wage laws across the country. If you learned something new, consider giving this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel if you'd like to continue exploring.